Okay, welcome to this special webinar. My name is Dr. Stephen Sussman, and I am the co-founder of the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Dr. Fleischman and I, along with a team of experts, created the center. The Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research is a nonpartisan public policy organization, a research center, and a think tank. We are a gathering of scholars, experts, and community stakeholders engaged in research and dialogue in an effort to create practical policy recommendations to current local, national, and international challenges. The center views politics and policy as a means to provide responses to public challenges in domestic and foreign affairs. Therefore, the center encourages discussion and research from multiple perspectives. We believe that good policy is the result of reasonable dialogue and healthy debate. Thus, through publishing balanced articles and community engagement, the center aspires to provide a platform for critical thinking, analysis, and ideas to confront challenges that affect our world. This evening, I want to recognize a specific board member. We have many board members engaged with the organization. Michael Landau, who's in the audience tonight, has been a board member from day one. His interest in the center has had a direct influence on our existence, no doubt. His contribution to policy research and education stretches beyond the Palm Beach Center. I'm very excited to tell you that today, Michael had an article published in The Hill. Many of you know The Hill, a website focusing on politics, policy, business, and international relations. So congratulations, Michael. We are proud to have you on our board and look forward to seeing more of your articles and opinion pieces. Please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org for all of our past webinars and our articles that our writers, our scholars write. Tonight's event is an excellent example of why the center exists. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Louise Fleischman and Dr. Jerry Spunberg, who will introduce or take us to the next step, introduce the person who will then introduce the speaker. How's that? So thank you. And by the way, Jerry is one of our esteemed board members as well. So we have active board members. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. And tonight it's a very special night. We have a very special speaker, a speaker with tremendous credentials, and Nancy Menges is going to introduce her momentarily. The theme and the subject matter that we are going to be discussing tonight is extremely important. You know, we hear a lot in the newspapers and through the media about the increasing influence of China. China is a superpower. That is not only a superpower because it's an economic power, but also because it has geopolitical ambitions.
I can learn to understand you much better.
And you can
get familiar with the way you talk. I need your permission to help.
Oh. I don't know where this interference is coming from.
Go ahead.
Okay. China's power is increasing. They have several programs, including Road and Belt and Road, which intends not only to increase the economic power of China, but also the political power. And the economic power is related to the political power and the kind of world hegemony that they are trying to achieve. So one of the things that we discovered throughout this pandemic is precisely the fact that all of a sudden we find ourselves, and many people actually found it for the first time, that we depend on China on our medicines, antibiotics. I think it's about 90% dependence on 90% of the antibiotics. And Rosemary, our keynote speaker tonight, is going to give us more detail about that. You know, she just wrote a book about it. She will talk about that book. And before I call on Nancy Menges, I want to introduce her. I want to thank Nancy because Nancy is the one that made the contact with Rosemary because she heard Rosemary before in a previous presentation, and she contacted me and said, that's the kind of speaker we need for our Center for Democracy and Policy Research. Now, before I call on Nancy, thank you so much for your contribution. I'm sure tonight is going to be an unforgettable night. Before I call on Nancy to introduce our keynote speaker, I want to call on Jerry Spamberg. But before I call on Jerry Dr. Spamberg, I want to say that Rosemary, the keynote speaker, will speak for about half an hour. Then the moderator, Dr. Spamberg and myself, we will ask a few questions, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Without further ado, Dr. Spamberg.
Thank you, Luis. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes, we can. I can.
Because I switched from my computer to my iPad because I wasn't getting the so using it.
You're breaking up a little bit.
A cancer specialist, and oh, let's see. Maybe if I go, let's see. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, so go on.
Okay. Well, I'm a cancer specialist, and I really was not familiar with this situation until I became aware of this evening's presentation, and I took it upon myself to read up about it this afternoon and to read actual testimony that was provided by Rosemary Gibson, I think, to a congressional panel about the problem, and it became very important to me. So I actually have a lot to learn from this presentation, but also a lot to ask. I think it's extremely important, especially in this environment. So I wanted to just express my opinion as a physician that this is a very important topic and one that we need to really address, and I think fairly urgently, especially in light of what's going on right now. So thank you for asking me to co-moderate this, and thank you to Rosemary Gibson for providing this important information to us this evening.
So now I want to call on Nancy to introduce the speaker. I want to say that Nancy is a member of our board. I've worked together with Nancy for the last almost 20 years, 16 years. And we worked together in a number of projects, including for the Center for Security Policy, where Rosemary also was a keynote speaker at one point. And we work on Latin America, and we are still working on Latin America. So without further ado, I want to call on Nancy to introduce the keynote speaker. Thank you so much, Nancy, for the great job you did in bringing us Rosemary.
Thank you, Luis. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Then let me begin. I had the great pleasure of meeting Rosemary Gibson about a year ago when she gave a terrific presentation on her book, China RX. Rosemary is an award-winning author, inspirational speaker, and advisor to organizations that advance for the public interest in healthcare. She is a national authority on healthcare reform, Medicare, patient safety, and overtreatment in medicine. Her critically acclaimed books include Medicare Meltdown, Battle Over Healthcare, Treatment Trap, and Wall of Silence. Rosemary is the 2014 recipient of the highest honor from the American Medical Writers Association for her outstanding contributions to the field of medical communication. She serves as senior advisor at the Hastings Center and as a section editor for the Journal of the American Medical Association. Rosemary has given presentations and grand rounds on patient safety at hundreds of hospitals and keynote meetings of major medical organizations and others such as AARP. She has briefed members of Congress and is currently working on legislation to reduce medical dependency on China. The Palm Beach Center is honored to have her as a speaker this evening, And now, Rosemary, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, everyone. And Nancy, a special shout out to you. It's great to see you again virtually. I
You too,
remember our
Rosemary.
meeting, and I'm delighted that we've had a chance to come back together again. And I'm so grateful to you for introducing me to Luis. We've had a couple of wonderful conversations. And Steve, I'm very impressed with your introduction to the center. And it's really a real pleasure for me to be among scholars and physicians this evening to talk about a subject that has implications for our geopolitics, our health security, our national security, and also something that affects us personally as people. So I'm really heartened and really tickled to be with all of you this evening. I'll just go through these slides, as Steve said, for about 30 minutes. And then this subject generates a lot of dialogue and questions and engagement, and I look forward to that. We all learn from each other. And the physician who is on, I want to address as a cancer specialist. China makes some of our oncology drugs and our generic ones, and there have been issues with those. So let's get started. In 2014, I was looking to write another book, and I had never studied China. I had never had any background in medicines and pharmaceuticals, but I stumbled on this subject matter, and it was so extraordinary in revealing and exposing how dependent the world is on a single country for so many of our basic medicines. And as you'll see, there were a number of incredible revelations that I'll share with you. And I thought this needs to be written. So I spent 3 years researching it. And if you look at China RX, you'll see that it has 900 footnotes because it's such an important topic that it deserves, the public deserves, physicians deserve, and our policymakers deserve the truth on a subject that affects us all, but which has not seen the light of day. And here it is, China RX. By the way, I was not paid to do this work. I did it because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I'd like to cover 4 points. First is, how dependent is the United States and the rest of the world on China for medicines? And the focus is going to be on the generic drugs, which are 90% of the medicines that are dispensed here in the US. How did we get here? What are the risks? And what do we need to do to mitigate these risks? So first, how dependent are we on China? Let's take a look back in 1988. While researching China RX, I came across a report from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And it was an extraordinary technical document in the spirit of emergency preparedness. It was a how-to guide to build and rebuild antibiotic fermentation plants if they were damaged or destroyed in an attack on the homeland. It identified each antibiotic facility, manufacturing facility in the United States, how much antibiotics they were making. We've all heard of penicillin, tetracycline, cephalosporins, and others. This report documented the volume made at each of those plants. It had the location of them, the contact information for the managers, the engineers operating them. There was a map of where they're located. So that was 1988. Where would we be today? The United States has virtually no capacity to manufacture any generic antibiotics. Those for ear infections in children. Antibiotics you take for bronchitis, strep throat, pneumonia, to treat sepsis, STDs, MRSA, and doxycycline for anthrax exposure. We used to make these in the United States, but we no longer make them. In the context of coronavirus, we've seen a preview of what biowarfare could look like. And we need antibiotics to treat infectious disease caused by bacteria. These are medical countermeasures, but we no longer have the capacity to make them. In 2001, after the anthrax attacks on Capitol Hill, the federal government needed to buy millions of doses of doxycycline, which is a recommended antidote for exposure. We had to go to a European company that in turn had to obtain the starting material from a plant in China. So we cannot make the antidotes for anthrax exposure. How dependent are we? This is the CEO of a European generic maker, Guy Valax, who I interviewed for China RX. And he said if China stopped exporting ingredients, the core components to make medicines, within 3 months, our pharmacy shelves would be pretty empty. China RX came out in April of 2018, and it actually predicted the current situation that we're in. It said that in the event of a natural disaster or global pandemic, the United States will be waiting in line with other countries for essential drugs. It's exactly what's been happening. How did we get here? And by the way, this is true not just for antibiotics, this is true for thousands of generic drugs that are necessary to run our healthcare systems in the best of times, and also to care for people with coronavirus when they're hospitalized, the sedatives, the norepinephrines, and so many others. How did we get here? How did this happen? In China RX, you can read about what I call the penicillin cartel. The United States can no longer make penicillin. The last plant closed in 2004. This was written up at that time in the New York Times about the closure of this plant. It was Bristol Myers Squibb owned it up in Syracuse, New York. But the New York Times didn't do the backstory. What was prompting its closure? China RX is the first and only place to report it. I'm going to show you some data from a European industry. They were very public-spirited people. They have an industry group called the European Fine Chemicals. And these are the people that make the key ingredients in our medicines. And they share these slides with me. And what are our medicines? They're basically chemicals formulated to help treat and prevent disease. And look at their subtitle, a 25-year landslide in the manufacture and business of active ingredients. Those are the things that make our medicines in Europe between 1983 and 2008. So what happened in the US is what's happened worldwide. So this is the penicillin cartel. There's a lot of moving parts here, but it's really quite simple. The bar graphs at the top are overall global production of penicillin material, not the finished pills, but the ingredients to make them. The sub-bars in the purplish blue color, that's China gaining an increasing global market share. The Chinese government did a very strategic move as part of its industrial policy. It invested heavily in infrastructure to make antibiotics, which in a country of more than 1 billion people certainly makes a lot of sense. Plus they have a really talented people with science, chemistry, and engineering skills. So China has increasing market share. But I want to direct your attention to the yellow line there, and that's price. And look at what happened in 2004. This is when China dumped penicillin material on the global market, beginning in 2004, the same year that Bristol Myers Squibb announced it was closing. And they kept that price low for several years. During that time, that's when the last US plant closed. Even Indian plants were shut down because they could not compete. So once China drove out most of its competitors, you can then see a steep price increase. This is a playbook that is evident in other sectors with steel, aluminum. We hear about dumping at below market prices. It's a way to get out your competitors. And so what happens is we have fewer and fewer companies that are making essential products like antibiotics. And this is one of the reasons that we have drug shortages in the United States. Hundreds and hundreds of drug shortages at any one time. When we talk about losing our manufacturing base, what does that really mean? This is an aerial view of this penicillin capability that used to make 70% of the global supply. And when Bristol Myers Squibb announced it was closing, that meant the demolition of 50 buildings, the loss of the talent, the infrastructure, the workforce, the know-how, gone. China's dominance is global. Dutch public television did a very forward-looking documentary last year. It's the only media outlet in the world that has focused on this issue. And the gentleman in the clip there is a person who used to work with a European group who provided the data. And he said something that was very surprising. You know, he's from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is not in a trade kerfuffle with China, but he said, now we're afraid that China will do things to deprive us of our medicine. There was an update to this documentary earlier this year in a COVID context. And he came out and said, yes, and now you can say that China owns the raw materials market worldwide to make our medicines. This is where China's chokehold is. In the bottom of the triangle are the finished drugs, the pills that we take. But our pills are made with the ingredients that make medicine medicine. That's the active ingredient. But China's chokehold is in the raw materials, those chemicals. It's a lot like the parallels with the rare earths, where China controls the rare earths. It's a dominant global supplier. We have a similar situation with our medicines. But we knew about rare earths. We haven't known about this until China RX, which was the first book to expose it. Now, China's rapidly moving up the value chain, and they're making about 10% of our generic drugs now. And here's some labels of selected generics made in China by its domestic companies. This is important, by its domestic companies, and sold here. The doxycycline, chemotherapy products, antidepressants, birth control pills, medicines for Alzheimer's, HIV/AIDS, and many, many more. China's it got about that 10% market share in just about 10 years. And it's ramping up very, very quickly. Chinese generic company has bought a shuttered manufacturing facility in North Carolina. And interestingly, this is the same company. It's a subsidiary of a company in China. And that company sold a contaminated blood pressure medicine ingredient to millions of Americans that had carcinogens in it, rocket fuel compounds. And recalls began in 2018 and has continued for a long time. And the amount of there were many companies involved in it, but in this particular Chinese company, the amount of carcinogen was more than 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. And as you know, blood pressure medicines are taken every day by people. When the FDA finally discovered it, it banned everything from that plant. And particularly disturbing is the company knew that its product did not meet US standards, but sold it anyway. And here it's building a plant here in North Carolina with millions of dollars in its government subsidies. Meanwhile, we're seeing Western generic companies collapse. These are the three largest Western generic companies. Mylan, based in the US, they announced last year that they're merging with Pfizer's generic. And there's Teva and Sandoz. Teva is the Israeli company, Sandoz is in the EU. And last year, both those companies announced they're dropping half their products because they cannot compete. And meanwhile, Pfizer announced last year the opening of its global generic headquarters in Shanghai.
Right.
One of the revelations that was quite remarkable is how India depends on China. We know that India has a very large generic industry, but it can't function without the raw materials and chemicals. 69% of what it needs for its generic industry is sourced from China. And I predict that China will overtake India in generic drug production within a decade, if not sooner. And that's because China has a plan, it has an industrial policy, and has put billions and billions of dollars in it, so it subsidizes its industries. I testified 3 times on Capitol Hill within the last year. And I got a question and I said, the response is, American and other companies are not competing with Chinese companies. They're competing with the Chinese government and its unlimited resources. Again, that's where India is dependent on those raw materials and chemicals. Another shockaroo was how India's military, here it is, a country with very large generic industry, its military depends on China for aspirin. By the way, we can't make aspirin anymore in the United States. We can't make vitamin C. India depends on China for these antibiotics, for metformin, which is a diabetes drug. So all roads lead to China when it comes to those core materials in our essential drugs. The China RX story has gotten out very widely. This book exposed it, and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle have been reading it. As I mentioned, hearings have been held in the Senate Small Business Committee with Senator Rubio, Anna Eshoo with the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee, and the U.S.-China Commission. But we're seeing what I call regrettable statements out there that are misleading and ill-informed. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce came out with a statement in an article saying that U.S. manufacturing, we're okay, we can meet 70% of current pharmaceutical demand. It's simply not true. Because what they're not looking at are the core chemicals, the components to make them. Remdesivir, which is a new drug that's being talked about and used in some cases for coronavirus, it has a number of components in it sourced from China. I've learned a lot from those people who are actually in the plants making medicines. These are brilliant chemists, they're engineers. These are the people that know where the products come from. It's not the lobbyists in Washington. And they will tell you that our supply chains depend on China. And when it comes to COVID drugs, I was sitting around a dinner table one evening with 4 engineers who've had about 150 years collective experience making medicines. And this is when the COVID was just ramping up. I said, so tell me, for the basic medicines to treat people who are hospitalized with coronavirus, like the sedatives, where do the starting materials come from to make them? I went around the table and each one of them said at least 90% of the basic materials to make those COVID drugs are sourced in China. What are the risks? Last summer at a hearing of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, this was a tremendous hearing from my point of view. It was the first public official forum to amplify this message. And the Secretary of Defense sent a representative to discuss the national security risks. And he said the risks of increased Chinese dominance of the global ingredient market cannot be overstated. And just as background, I was asked to brief the Defense Logistics Agency last year. They had no idea about the extent of this dependence, but once they found out, full court press to understand their vulnerability. And this hearing certainly elevated that. As I said in my testimony, I'll just mention some excerpts. Medicines can be used as a weapon of war. In the hands of an adversary, they can be weaponized, supplies can be withheld. They can be made with lethal contaminants, sold without any real medicine with in them. And these products can be distributed to specific targets. Detection is time-consuming at best and virtually impossible at worst. And if you control, whoever controls medicines, you control the world. Think of it. If you're sitting in the White House and you get a call and you're asked to do something by a geopolitical adversary who can withhold essential drugs to save lives, that's tremendous leverage. And I will say that more than 12 years ago, China threatened the United States with drug shortages if the federal government did not do certain things. And most recently, during the COVID situation, China once again threatened to withhold medicines and throw Americans into an ocean of coronavirus. That was reported in the Chinese media. So what do we do? How do we turn this research into policy change? The first recommendation in China RX grew out of a remarkable statement that someone made to me that I quoted in the book. This person said, it's no one's job in the federal government to know who controls the supply of our drugs. So the first recommendation is a whole of government continuous review to know where our medicines come from, to assess our vulnerabilities, and to have a point of accountability to ensure an uninterrupted supply of quality medicines. And I'm heartened to say that this has been underway. When I testified before Congress, the FDA person was ahead of me on the earlier panel, and it was clear that the FDA was tasked with beginning to answer this question. The US Senate, there were senators from both sides of the aisle that asked the Secretary of Defense, have their staff come meet with them to talk about the Defense Department's vulnerabilities and what can be done. And there has been legislation introduced by Senator Warren, Senator Rubio, and others, Senator Cotton, to address our national health security and national security risks brought about by our exposure. A second recommendation I made in my testimony is, how do we begin to bring some of this manufacturing back? And the best thing I could come up with is, let's begin to use our federal tax dollars that are to buy medicines for our veterans, for the military, and for the strategic national stockpile. Let's begin to use that money and have the federal departments prioritize the purchasing of drugs made here in the US. And indeed, several bills have this as their provisions. And in addition, last year I drafted on my home computer a Buy American executive order that would do just this. And that has morphed into something that is, I have not seen it, but it greatly expands on this. It was done by the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. It's under review, and it's certainly facing some headwinds. And the intent here is just for the essential drugs, the 100, 200 essential drugs we need to run our healthcare systems. And it's really quite remarkable that there's opposition to do that. The global pandemic has brought home the reality that we need some degree of self-sufficiency. More than 75 countries banned exports of medicines and supplies. And understandably so, they need them for their own people. So half the EU states withheld exports. The UK banned exports. So in a pandemic, we're on our own. And that argues for some minimum self-sufficiency of medicines we need to run our healthcare systems, our ICUs, our emergency departments. It was surprising that some manufacturers just refused to tell country of origin of medicine to the Department of Defense and the VA, and certainly to the rest of us. There was legislation introduced about 12 years ago to do just that, and I asked someone in the industry, so why hasn't there been country of origin bills passed? And this person with 30 years experience said, well, they probably think it wouldn't be good for their business if their customers knew where their products were coming from. So this clearly was hidden. And as someone said to me, why did it take someone like you, a private citizen, to expose this? I said, because no one would pay anybody to do this. And someone else said they'd probably pay you not to do it. Another recommendation that I made when I was up at the Defense Logistics Agency in Philadelphia is that they should contract for independent testing of selected generic drugs it purchases. And here's why. There's a group that started on the Yale Science campus. It's an online pharmacy called Valisure. It was started by two people, one of whom is a microbiologist from Yale and another person who has had chronic health conditions and found that some of the medicines that he was taking just didn't seem right. And so they started testing. And they found that more than 10% of the generics they tested did not meet standards. We just did a webinar with them today. These are the folks that found the carcinogens in Zantac, ranitidine, that was eventually taken off the market. This group of 28 employees, they're the ones that found that, filed a citizen petition to the FDA, which dragged its feet. And finally, it took it off, it recalled it. They also found the same problem with metformin. So this is Valisure. I have no financial interest in them. I just think they're doing something. They're an online pharmacy, and I tell people if you want to know what to do and you want to have your drugs tested, you might want to consider looking into these folks if you need generic drugs. This is their website, and here's an example of what they found. This is a very common blood pressure medicine called lisinopril. And they tested you can see on the x-axis, they tested the brand and 5 generics. And each of those little horizontal lines, they test 3 batches of each. On the left-hand side, you see the brand product, and this is the amount of active ingredient in it, and it's all hovers around 100%, a little bit above. But look at the generic on the right-hand side, number 5. Look at the variation in the amount of active ingredient in it. From the mid-90s, low 90s to over 100. That kind of variability suggests huge problems with their quality control. As an online pharmacy, they would sell the one in the middle, G3, which was consistently close to the mark. So they test for active ingredient. They test whether it dissolves properly in the body. They test for some contaminants. And remarkably, nobody else does that. The FDA doesn't do this. Nobody tests these things. And again, more than 10% of what they tested didn't meet standard. Why do we have poor quality and shortages? This is again from the people actually are in the plants making medicines. And this is an engineer and CEO, and he described his own experience of getting a 90-day supply of this generic lisinopril. And the price at the retail pharmacies, he went to 2, and one was $157, the other was $22 for a 90-day supply. And he said, guess how much the manufacturer gets paid for that? $1. So we've hammered down on manufacturing, and that money's going somewhere else. And this is why we've lost our generic drug industry. We have to pay a fair price to manufacturers, not a race to the bottom price. One of the recommendations I've also made to Congress is to invest in continuous manufacturing of generic drugs. This is advanced manufacturing technology. There's been more advances in the manufacturing of potato chips than there has been in our drugs. This is technology developed here in the United States. I'm delighted to say that because of some work that I did putting good people together, a contract was awarded $350 million to a group in Virginia to bring up advanced manufacturing of critical drugs for COVID patients for the Strategic National Stockpile. They're going to make the active ingredient, stockpile it, have a facility right next door in case they have to have surge capacity, and that within weeks they can turn that around into finished drugs for the next pandemic or natural disaster. They're also going to be supplying a group of private sector hospitals, 1,200 hospitals, that are coming up with new supply chains to stop shortages. I don't have these video clips here, but this was a remarkable, in closing here, a remarkable statement by a 32-year Army colonel who was a member of the US-China Commission. And in the course of the hearing, he just spoke up extemporaneously about his own experience with his blood pressure medicines. He said, quote, "My blood pressure medication, there were 3 of them, were contaminated with rocket fuel from a company in China. I imagine active duty people have the same problem, active duty military. This affects the readiness of our troops." So we have a very serious problem, and it needs to be fixed. Where are we now? There's been a lot of awareness in Washington about this problem. Many senators have spoken about it, which is heartening to see. And it, with all humility, it stems from China RX. Without that, we'd be nowhere talking about it. But we've been short on action. The Buy American executive order is still under review, and there's pushback from special interests that like the status quo. There is the contract that is making critical drugs here in the United States. It will be ramping up. That's a good thing, but we have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to end there. I hope you'll take a look at China RX. I wrote it in the public interest. We donate proceeds to good causes. It's on Amazon. And share it with members of Congress, if you teach. This is a topic that affects us all, and we have to fix it. We have to fix it fast. And there's my contact information. I'm on Twitter, Rosemary100. You can follow me. I give updates on what's going on, and there's my email address. So I'll stop there, and really look forward to questions, comments, dialogue, and we'll have at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Excellent.
Terrific. Luis, Luis and Jerry, do you two want to?
Yes, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for doing this wonderful job of writing a book and exposing these facts. I think everyone will agree that this presentation has been fascinating, and I look forward to reading the book, China RX. Now, I have a question, and that will be my only question, and then I will pass it on to Dr. Spamberg and then to the audience. I think what I'm grasping from you is that there is an element of complicity between our capitalistic system and this Chinese takeover of the monopoly on generic drugs and antibiotics. You also describe basically fraud, right? Like generic medicines that actually do not meet the standards.
That's right.
But we have the FDA, right? And the drug companies. Do they know that? Are they accomplices in all this? Can you explain that dynamic? I mean, how is that?
How is it possible?
These
right?
facts of fraud were discovered by people that were small people relatively. Yes.
It's really remarkable. You know, manufacturers are the front line of quality. And in the United, back to capitalism, we have 3 very large companies that purchase or procure 90% of the generic drugs that are sold in the United States. And they do it strictly on the basis of price. If they can find something for 5 cents cheaper for a 50-gallon drum, that's what they'll go for. And just like the example of the blood pressure medicine paying the manufacturer $1 and selling it for up to $157, that's how they make their money. And these are Fortune 10 and 20 companies. So there's complicity, if I can use that term, on both sides. And that's why it's so hard to change this. And insofar as quality is concerned, these big purchasers, they rely on the FDA to do inspections. But think of it, right now, the FDA is not in those plants because of coronavirus. They've withdrawn all their inspectors from other countries.
Yes, but coronavirus is new. What
Right.
happened before?
At some point, here's the situation. If you and I, Louis, were going to the shopping mall this weekend and we were looking to buy the cheapest possible t-shirts, we talked about this on the phone. The FDA can't stop you and me from buying the cheapest t-shirt that'll fall apart in a couple weeks. The only thing they can do is once it's on the market, once it's being sold or imported here, they can try to stop it.
Have
But
they?
there's so much to stop, so much to do. It's beyond their capability.
Have they? Have they tried?
Certainly not in the way the American people would expect. I liken it to Boeing and the FAA, where the industry keeps a very close thumb on the FDA. During testimony, I called for testing of generic drugs. I said the FDA is not up to it. I'd like to see independent testing with a Consumer Reports type model. And the FDA person was sitting in the back. This was unusual. Stayed over and was listening to and was shaking their head. No, no, no. That's exactly what we need because the FDA can't do it because they're so compromised. And, the market is broken. Think about this. We're in a situation now, and I want to talk about oncology drugs here for a minute, given our physician who will be talking soon. In 2015, the FDA ended up banning about 29 products from China, the ingredients, because of serious concerns about quality. But because we are so dependent on China, the FDA exempted them from its own ban. And among the products exempted were daunorubicin, a common chemotherapy, another chemotherapy product, and antibiotics. So we've come to a situation where the FDA has to make trade-offs because there are so few suppliers, because China's driven them out to below market price, coupled with big companies here that want cheap. So there's too few suppliers left. And the quality is not what it should be. I mean, this is unthinkable for most of us on this call. When we were growing up, this was unthinkable. So the FDA is having to make these trade-offs, as is the European Medicines Agency. So that's why we have to get back to a more balanced playing field. And there are some solutions we can talk about with what a group of private hospitals, 1,200 hospitals, are doing to try to fix this. We can talk about that in a minute. So it's a real challenge, Luis, with FDA not doing its job. And I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of the FDA's ability to protect us. The State Department came out with an advisory last weekend advising people who are planning to go to China that they could be detained and they could be banned from exiting China to come back to the United States. So, what federal employee is going to want to go to China to do inspections? I think we're seeing what I put it on Twitter, the nail in the coffin of FDA inspections in China.
Can I say something?
Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah. Rosemary, I am a government contractor, U.S. government contractor, located here in Philadelphia, and we do a lot of business with the DLA, Defense Logistics Agency.
Uh-huh.
And we supply fabric for the clothing and textile field. And it came back to us from the subsistence and medicine that the Chinese, they were buying milk from the Chinese, and they were adding something, to add protein to the content of the milk. They were adding melamine. Now, melamine we use to stiffen fabrics for backpacks. We use as a fabric stiffener. So they got caught. And I don't know what happened, but we did get we heard through the back door that that's what they were doing. So that's just a, and there were, excuse me, that was milk for infants.
And that, okay, yeah, that was the melamine scandal where the infant formula was, and it was also, pet food was contaminated with melamine about 12 years ago, and thousands of dogs and cats here died of kidney failure. And when
Right.
China RX first came out, people said, my goodness, I wouldn't feed my dog food from China. Why are we buying medicines from them? Because there just isn't the same ethic. One of the people I interviewed said the attitude of the Chinese is this, that one of the reasons our products are so cheap is we assume no liability for them. Think about that.
We actually heard it from a contracting officer at the DLA. So I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
There are a lot of good people I met at the DLA who want to do the right thing, but they're very constrained in what they can do. We have to, break open that and get new suppliers in there, trustworthy suppliers who want to supply quality products for men and women in the military and their families.
Do others have questions?
Well, I have some comments and questions.
Joe,
you-
Joe, go right ahead.
This is Jerry Spunberg.
Oh, Jerry, sorry. I thought
Yeah,
it
can
was,
you hear,
yeah.
do you hear me okay? Is that
Yeah.
all right?
I can hear you, Jerry.
Okay. First of all, great presentation, but I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something about Europe and European drug companies. Is this something that is a problem mostly unique to the United States, or is it a problem perceived all over the world in the dependency on China? Of course, we have particular concerns, but is this something that other countries are worried about, like in Europe?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. In fact, in recent weeks, the European Commission and the industry have come out and said we need to bring some of the manufacturing back of the core ingredients for essential drugs. They all experience shortages and rationing, just like we have here. Japan has done the same thing. So this is a worldwide problem.
Well, Israel is very advanced in many scientific areas. Are they in any way attacking this problem? Because they're usually pretty advanced in the research area and maybe addressing a problem like this. Have you heard anything from Israel?
I haven't heard anything about Israel, but I can say with Teva, again, these are the generic drugs. The bread and butter medicines have been around for years. The research has been done, we just have to make them. As I mentioned, Teva has announced that last year that it was dropping about half its products, in part because it just can't compete with the lower cost producers and the subsidized prices. And that's a real shame, both for Teva and Sandoz.
Indeed. I was going to say that I happened to have been with my wife in Shanghai a little over a year ago. We went actually on vacation, but while I was there, I went to visit a very impressive radiation oncology facility, because I'm a cancer specialist, but I mainly deal with radiation, not so much with drugs. And just outside of Shanghai near the airport, there is a facility that's it's entirely funded by the government. It uses a particle beam called the carbon ion. Mm-hmm. And there are several in China, a couple in Japan, and a couple in Europe. In the United States, we don't have any. They were going to build one in Colorado. Mm-hmm. The project was canceled because there was no funding for it. It's not a highly profitable venture, but it's probably one of the most advanced forms of treatment for many types of cancers. And people in China from all over the country go there to be treated. And I went to get a private tour at the carbon ion facility, and it was very impressive. In fact, a Chinese physicist, Dr. Wu, who is also at the University of Miami, is in charge of radiation biology research at that center. That's how I got to go there, and he gave me a personal tour. And this is the kind of project that China is able to do because they have such heavy government funding for this.
Right, exactly.
Where in our country, we don't have even a single facility. This is different from proton beam. You may have heard of proton beam, which is also coming into the fore. But this is more advanced than proton beam and much more expensive. There's one in Switzerland and Germany, but we don't have a single one in this country because no one wants to build it because we can't make a profit and the government won't fund it. As I said, the project in Colorado. So I'm familiar with ways that the government can influence medical care. So with that in mind, I was going to ask you if, aside from the pharma industry, if there are other areas where China and the government in China are taking advantage of or monopolizing different, we know about production of electronic components, many other things. Are you aware of other similar problems like that, different from the pharma industry where we're also dependent on China?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I went to a hearing on Capitol Hill that was really quite remarkable. And there was a gentleman testifying about 20 advanced industrial sectors in the US and other Western countries. And he documented a systemic effort by China, given its really smart industrial policy strategy, to dominate and displace those 20 sectors. And they range from telecommunications and semiconductors. And it's the same story. We've relied on sort of market forces and individual initiative, but that does not work when you're competing against, a government with virtually unlimited resources. And China's demonstrated that a very targeted industrial policy can be highly successful in growing an economy with, in a country with 1.3 billion people. In contrast, our process is very slow, cumbersome, and painstaking. And I don't think we're in a situation where we're keeping up. Neither is Europe. So there are many. Yeah.
Did you feel that the political situation here has any effect in terms of which party is in power? Does it make a difference? Is it something that's accepted by both parties as a concern? You would think that at this moment we're caught up with the pandemic, but does it make a difference how the election turns out in November, or does it make no difference at all?
Well, this has been going on since the 1990s, and where we saw the real collapse of here's what happened. I was sitting at the same desk where I am now, and it occurred to me that once we opened up free trade with China in the year 2000, which basically reduced tariffs on products that they sent to the US, that's when we lost the last penicillin plant. That's when we lost our last aspirin plant, our last vitamin C ascorbic acid plant. And that was supported by Democrats and Republicans. And nobody did anything. We had a vitamin C cartel where, long story short on that, but over successive Republican and Democrat administrations, there was nobody providing leadership to ensure that we have what we need as a country. I say some of these medicines are strategic assets that we need as a country to survive. And there hasn't been a whole lot of leadership. And if we want to have, a viable healthcare system, it seems to me we need that kind of capability.
Steve, there are a number of questions here that are actually coming.
Can I just ask Jerry, what hospital are you with, sir?
Oh, I work with a number of hospitals in our area. I work at several tenant hospitals, including Palm Beach Gardens, Good Samaritan, St. Mary's. I've also been affiliated with HCA hospitals like JFK, Palms West, some independent hospitals like Wellington. But mostly I work in an outpatient freestanding facility, and I actually work with a company now called Genesis, which is based in Australia. It's interesting how we've been taken over. The company I work for, which is an American company based in Fort Myers, Florida, was recently bought out by Genesis Australia, which is a very large international company, headquartered in Sydney. They run many of the cancer programs around the world, including England, Spain, Australia, and now in the US and other countries. So we become like a member of a global enterprise, which is actually a good thing because they're very well funded and very interested in coordinating research projects around the world. They have these international town hall meetings. I have one next week where the CEO from Australia gets on and they have all these experts. They're working on programs.
Is that where Dr. Wu is at Genesis? No, it's breaking up, Jerry.
Yeah.
Oh, we lost you.
Well,
All right. Steve, question.
Yeah, let me ask the questions of those who posted on the chat log. We do have we have a couple questions. I also want to encourage the students from Barry University here this evening. If you have any questions, please feel free to post or ask. So Laura Fleischman asks, it looks like the public sector has abdicated from its role to hold these companies accountable. And the private sector is driven by making money and will not police themselves. Who can take a lead on doing this?
I agree, Laura, with your assessment. Here's, on a positive note, the Mayo Clinic and about 12, here's where the private sector can play a role and is playing a role. The Mayo Clinic and about 1,200 other hospitals put their money together to form a nonprofit. And they want to fix these shortages of medicines that many hospitals experience. Johns Hopkins and Mayo, basic medicines in shortage. And so they hired a CEO who's been in pharmaceutical manufacturing for many years. And within the first year of operation, they contracted with reputable companies in trustworthy countries. And they delivered 20 drugs that had been in shortage for the rest of the country. They delivered 20 essential medicines like vancomycin. That's a last resort antibiotic. They had it made and delivered to their member hospitals. Full transparency on price, on country of origin. They don't pay a race to the bottom price, and they don't gouge their members. The second year, they delivered another 20 products, and within 5 years, they'll have 100 products. And they're going to start building their own manufacturing facility here on the East Coast. So the beauty of this is they're taking their procurement dollars, the money that they spend buying things, and they're buying differently. They're buying a higher quality product from people that they know and trust. Kaiser Permanente, with its 12 million members, just came on as a member of that group. And so we'll be getting not just to inpatient hospital care, but to the pharmacies at Kaiser. And they made a deal with some of the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. So this to me is a tremendous private sector initiative, and it's not the typical market with venture capital where you come in, make a lot of money, and then leave. We're in it for the long haul to solve a very serious problem. So I think that's terrific, coupled with independent testing by that company in New Haven. I think that's another way to go to root out the bad actors. And we have a lot of cleanup to do, but it's really heartening to see that we've started.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the audience from Joel Levin. So Joel, if you'd like to ask your question.
There is also a question from Elizabeth Tal. I don't know where you saw it.
Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. 3 very quick things. First, I won't ask for a response, but I think the analysis about the economic situation in capitalism with the United States and China that was offered briefly is pretty much about 99% wrong. And I'm happy to discuss that with you some other time. I think what's happened in China is just a recognition of a large market and a tremendous economic slowing down, and has very, very little to do in large ways with a kind of socialist schema works better than capitalism refrain that people use. But let me ask you my 2 questions. First, one's legal and one's economic. The legal is that anti-dumping has been part of American law for at least 20 years, and it's part of the WTO, and it's been successfully used as a strategy on consumer goods, on some commodities, and on steel. And if I were Bristol, Squibb, if I were a manufacturer and there was actual dumping, which is a defined term, which you defined it exactly right, which is below market value in a particular market to drive out competition and then put the price back up. Why hasn't it been used? I mean, from what you say, it would be easy to be used, and with the WTO, it would be successful, but you don't even need the WTO. Our government acts unilaterally, and then somebody got a challenge in the WTO. The second, so that won't take you long to answer. The second question is, there's a maldistribution of all raw materials in the world. Some countries, Saudi Arabia has oil, Chile has lithium. How many of there are two levels here of the problem. There's the problem of the finished good, the actual pill that somebody pops, and then there's the source or the raw material, often which could be synthesized or could be replaced and sometimes can't, like lithium. What percentage of are we talking about of the drug market that China is virtually the only supplier that would present a sort of really big problem? That is, if you need lithium batteries in Chile and Australia won't sell them to you, you won't have a lithium battery. How much of the medication market is like that for China? I'm done.
Yeah, there are literally thousands of chemicals and raw materials needed to make our drugs. And there's no catalog that lists them all and where they're from. But what we can say is that tip of the triangle, whereas if you have to go out on the market and buy those raw materials, which companies were doing during coronavirus, we heard about the scramble for masks and ventilators. What was not talked about was the scramble for those raw materials and chemicals sourced largely from China. That was off the radar. And that's in part because those are considered trade secrets by companies. They don't want to let their competitors know where they get their stuff from, but it's largely from China. And if you ask me which ones, it's not like lithium batteries. These are chemical molecules. These are, again, I would leave that to the engineers and chemists to describe them. But there is consensus that China is the go-to source for the vast majority of those products needed to make our drugs. On the anti-dumping, there was a case of the last aspirin plant here in the United States. It was owned by a French company. And they actually brought a case to the Federal Trade Commission, but it was too little too late. What was happening is, even though if they're dumping, you still need customers, businesses who will buy your product. And those large purchasers will very happily buy the lower cost product. And there's no advocacy. I was sitting in a meeting in Washington, and I looked around the room and I said, there's no advocacy here in Washington for domestic manufacturing of critical drugs necessary for our national security and health security. If you go to the Department of Commerce, it's all about exporting. It's not about protecting our industrial base. So we have to, start from scratch. And I'll just say on antitrust, take a look at the vitamin C cartel case. Same thing, dumping, export controls, price fixing. And a handful of companies brought an antitrust case in federal court in New York, and they won. A Brooklyn jury said, yeah, there was clear evidence, unequivocal evidence of dumping. The Chinese government and the companies appealed. And it was quite remarkable that the appellate court sided with the Chinese companies, saying, well, the Chinese government said it required its companies as a matter of Chinese law to fix prices and control supply. And we can't expect those companies to abide by Chinese law and US law at the same time. So in the interest of international comity, we're going to vacate the lower court decision. That effectively allowed any country to form cartels to send whatever they want here at fixed prices, while our companies have to abide by US antitrust law. And by the way, there was no US Department of Justice intervention in Republican and Democratic administrations for many years. This has been an ongoing case for 15 years. It was finally brought with the help of the Justice Department to the US Supreme Court. And in a unanimous decision written by Justice Ginsburg 2 years ago, they instructed the appellate court to take it back because they said the appellate court put too much credence in what the Chinese government said, that it required its companies as a matter of law to fix prices, because there was evidence introduced at trial that that wasn't true. So it's a tough going, and you need friends and you need help. And we've got to, this is part of the process of rebuilding some minimal capability here. Thank you for the question. And we can talk offline about the other part.
Thank you.
Rosemary,
Sure.
thank you. We have a number of people asking questions on the
Sure.
chat. Would you like me to go one at a time or just give you 3 straight questions? Or?
Let's do one at a time, and I'll try to be quick.
Perfect. Okay, so Elizabeth Ball is asking, is this issue the case in South America as well?
I would think so, because it's Europe is the other largest producer of chemicals and ingredients, and they're in the same situation. Japan is. So I would assume that it is.
Okay. And Brett Sandella is asking, wouldn't the government have recognized this danger at some point and stepped in to support companies that would produce medicines within the US?
You would think so.
Right.
We had this whole, as a private citizen, we had this whole biodefense establishment in this country. And how they miss the fact that we can't make antibiotics is absolutely stunning. And it took a private citizen like me to bring it to the fore. I briefed, at a senior level, people in the national security apparatus and others who did not know this. But I can say now they're grateful to know. That's
Thank you. And Joe Crisco is asking, since China's dominance is such an issue, are there any talks or interest of the US getting together with Europe or any other country, to any other region or continent, to manufacture drugs?
What I see happening is within regions and countries, like Japan is talking about it, the EU is talking about it, and there is some conversation here in the US. It's not across continent or across region. I think you have to develop your own support at home, and then maybe, have some alliances.
Terrific.
Steve,
Yes.
question, because I want to follow up on the question that Brett asked. Precisely one of the slogans, I would say, or one of the policies that the Trump administration actually stated was the issue of returning the manufacturing, independence, right? What is called the independence, anti-globalization, if you wish. And that's part of, that issue is part of the global economy. And still what the administration has done. I mean, it seems to me, Rosemary, that based on your answer to Brett's question, you are saying, yes, you would think they would do something, but there is not much has been done in terms of initiatives by the government, because you actually faulted the lack of advocates. But we are dealing with a government that actually is claiming to speak on behalf of the national industry.
Yeah. I'll just say this. There is an Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, which is probably the first time we've had one, run by Peter Navarro. And they are really onto this. But then you have a lot of other people in the administration who have a more, say, global view of things. And, in government, you need, it helps to have advocates on the outside to push for certain policies. And as I said, there's no advocacy in Washington for this. It's really quite shocking. With the steel industry, at least we had, 27% of steel production was made in the US, was in the US. And so you had an industry with lobbyists going up on Capitol Hill and in the White House advocating for tariffs. We don't have that. It's all on the other side. And those forces are very, very, very powerful. What we're talking about capitalism, what we're seeing here is, it was like, if you have a ThinkPad, and it used to be made by IBM, the laptops. So I remember talking with a guy from IBM, and he says, oh yeah, we gave all that away to China, the specs, in return for having access to their 1.3 billion people to sell them higher value products and services. The same thing is happening with our medicines. Companies gave the specs away for antibiotics and all these other generic drugs, China, and let China make the generics in return for these companies selling their, higher margin branded products in China to their 1.3 billion people. That's where the money is. So the generics have been thrown under the bus, and they don't want those relationships hampered. So there's very entrenched forces, and these things don't happen overnight. But we're trying to make some progress.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. Luis, or do we have any other questions?
Let me look. I mean, Joe actually was the last one.
Yeah.
There are a few more questions. I think there is a question.
I think I asked.
The rest are all comments.
Correct.
The rest are all comments, I think, and no more questions. Rosemary, would you like to say something to the audience? I know that when we talk privately, you talk about the possibility of you asking questions to the audience. And
Sure.
I don't know whether there is something that you have in mind, or you think
Sure.
we are done for today, something that you suggest us,
Sure.
I know that you've been briefing Congress. What kind of legislation do we have now that we can support, or write letters, or maybe write an article in our website?
Right. There have been
Contact the media in our local media. Yeah.
there have been bills introduced in the House and Senate by Democrats and Republicans, and a number of them would have the Defense Department and other federal agencies be incented to buy essential drugs made here in the U.S. They would have priority for that. There are also bills that would support advanced manufacturing of our drugs, which we can make then faster and cheaper here in the United States. That's, I think, Senator Blackburn from Tennessee is leading the charge on that. So there's some good provisions out there, but as always, we need consensus, and we need to get this over the hill. I don't think it's going to happen this year, an election year, but I know that there are people on both sides of the aisle that want to see something done, and see if we can do it when the time is right. And it'll be great to have, op-eds coming from your center, from your leaders here on this webinar and others. Since you have Senator Rubio that really has been outspoken on this, I'm sure people like that would like the support of people in their own state. So that's progress in just a year, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you for giving us that charge to go out and speak with our Congress people, with Rubio, and with and writing our own letters and staying on top of this. So,
Rick Scott.
Well, I think it will be worth the while to get just an op-ed with a specific legislation, with some background and a specific legislation.
I can.
And I am sure Rosemary wrote something.
I can be in touch with you about the state of the current bills with Senator Rubio. And also Rick Scott has a staff member that's very interested in this from a defense perspective, national security perspective. So you'd have some, fertile ground there in the state of Florida. And to have your, interest in this, I think would.
What's the name of that staffer?
I don't have it offhand, but he's Senator Scott's defense national security person.
It's not the J.R. Sanchez, right?
Oh, I know JR. That's Senator Rubio. I've had the pleasure.
Yeah, he works for Rubio. Yes.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of meeting him. But Senator Scott also has a defense national security expert, and
we'll find out.
And he really understands this issue.
okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Luis, if you and Jerry, if you two have nothing else to say, I will close it out. Then I will. Okay. Well, very good.
I want to thank our speaker, and I want to thank Nancy for bringing us our speaker. I think you've been terrific, Rosemary, and I think on behalf of the center, the Palm Beach Center for Democracy and Policy Research. I want to thank you, and I welcome you to write or reproduce articles in our website written by you.
Oh, I'd be honored to do that. Yeah, I have to say I'm very impressed with your group, Steve, the way you introduced it as, you know, scholars doing policy research and in a thoughtful, bipartisan way. It's a really great mission. And, you know, these are complex issues, and if we can talk about them in a reasonable way and create understanding. So I'd love to follow up with you, Luis, on that.
Definitely. We have, I know we need to talk over the phone on other matters, so we will include that.
I look forward to it.
And lastly, I have two other points. One is, for those who don't know, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and please visit our website at palmbeachdemocracy.org. And there's a little button there on the bottom called donations, and feel free to click it here and there occasionally. And also I'd like to thank, it's always wonderful when students come, and I had, it looked like 3 students from my class this evening come, and they're graduating with their Master of Public Administration degree at the end of this term. And I hope they certainly got something out of this, and I thank them for coming. And
Steve, just for your students, I want them to know, look, I'm just a citizen, and individuals can make a difference, taking research and turning it to policy. So that's a great lesson for students to learn. Don't think it's impossible. You can make a difference.
And their projects, their capstone projects, are exactly that, looking at issues and problems and how they can affect change in policy. So thank you for saying that, Rosemary. And I thank you so much for coming. And I certainly thank everyone here tonight. We would definitely not be an organization without every person here. And we look forward to your continued engagement with the organization, Rosemary. Thank you so much. And I wish everyone a good evening.
And thank the audience, thank everyone for participating.
Yes.
Thank you, Rosemary. And thank you, Jerry and Stephen.
Thank you, Michael,
And
and everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Wonderful
Bye-bye.
presentation.
Thank
Very
you.
impressive group. Thank you. Have
Thank
a
you
good
very
night.
much. Bye-bye now.